Thank you for joining us for what's sure to be an excellent webinar on the preservation of community ponds, shorelines, and stormwater systems. Joining us today are panelists Josh McGarry of SOLitude Lake Management and Matt Kuisle of Reserve Advisors. Before we do kick off the meeting and hand this over to Matt and Josh, we do have two quick housekeeping items. First, today's demonstration will be recorded. We'll be sending this to all registrants later this afternoon. And then both Josh and Matt will be available at the conclusion of today's webinar to answer any questions you might have. So as you do have questions, there is a chat section within the Zoom meeting. Feel free to leave those questions there, and Matt and Josh will be sure to address those at the end of today's presentation. Real quick, we do have an agenda for today's presentation. So we're going to be going over several frequently asked questions and best practices that relate specifically to ponds, stormwater systems, shoreline stabilization, shoreline restoration, as well as some general maintenance cost information for specific maintenance activities. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt.
Hey, good morning, everyone. For those that don't know us, we're Reserve. I'm Executive Director for Reserve Advisors. I've been doing reserve studies and helping communities plan for their needs, capital needs, for just over 21 years now. I'm a civil and environmental engineer, and so ponds are near and dear to my heart, as water resources are one of our biggest entities here throughout the United States. And my experience we work with over 10,000 associations. I'm located in Tampa, Florida, but we do work with communities all over the United States, 2,500 here in Florida alone. And one of the things that just continually surprises boards of directors of these community associations is the amount of work that their ponds, or the amount of maintenance and eventually a lot of times capital needs that their ponds require, their ponds or stormwater, other type of stormwater collection systems. So we wanted to bring this great education to you. We have a great expert, Josh, from SOLitude, so we're partnering with him to just bring this information awareness to the communities. We're going to give definitely some options on costs and just things to look out for, so that you as managers and boards can really help prepare your communities for what the ponds need. So I'm going to kind of let Josh run the details here, but just wanted to introduce myself, and we'll be here to answer questions, like Matt said, afterwards, and really prepare your communities for needs. So as a board of directors, we want to make sure that you're not surprised by any of these expenses. So Josh, I can turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Great, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Matt, I appreciate you having me. So a little background about myself. I've been in the lake and wetland management business for about 14 years. I am also in the Tampa area, a little bit south of where Matt is, and near Bradenton. My role is the regional sales manager for SOLitude Lake Management, which means I manage all of the sales in Florida and actually the South region from Southeast, basically North Carolina down. So I started from the ground up as a technician, was on the operations side, and moved into the sales and managed both. And now I'm managing sales. So pretty much every question we're going to run into today, I've come firsthand and seen, and I've helped educate boards and the like. So with all that said, I'm ready to get going here. We're gonna go on to the first question here in pond maintenance. How and why does the maintenance needs of a pond change over its life cycle? And we're going to touch base on a couple of best practices here as well. So think about your pond, your stormwater pond, or even it's a natural lake or pond. It's a biological entity, right? Just like me and you, we're each unique. Every pond is unique. So we all have a start date, a middle date, and an end date, basically. So ponds age just like us. So when especially in the Southeast, where a majority of our participants are from, a lot of these ponds are man-made, and they're dug for stormwater or flood control, basically, and non-point source pollution control. So think of it as it's you go into a new community, you have a new pond, and the pond is first dug. So at that point, it's new, it's fresh, it's able to readily recycle all those nutrients from stormwater runoff that will happen. You know, your fertilizers, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your oils from the road, pretty much anything that goes on an impervious surface will land in those stormwater retention ponds. And when ponds are newly dug, they can recycle that, readily recycle that. Now, as they age, just think about the constant nutrient loading that's always happening. Whenever it rains, there's going to be nutrient loading from stormwater runoff, also nutrient load from the soil up into the water. So they're constantly being pummeled with that nutrient load and those pollutants. Now, ponds will continue as they get older. They will not be able to recycle that nutrient load or that overload over time. So a typical, you know, some ponds can last, you know, start showing, you know, signs of nutrient overload in 10 years, some 20 years, some 30 years, really depends on the specific pond. So some maintenance needs to do with this would be things like flocking, nutrient abatement, water quality assessments. There's also, you know, siltation, muck accumulation, things like that. So other needs can come in as the ponds age. Some best practices for that would be adding like annual water quality monitoring. That would be a very good start. Just to get a baseline assessment of where your pond is, what the nutrient loading is, what the dissolved oxygen content throughout the water column is, and so on and so forth. Another really important best practice is best management practices education. Especially, you know, in the Southeast or in Florida, a lot of your common grounds landscapers should be, and I believe are required to be, best management practices certified. And that is basically educating when and where to apply fertilizer, what times of the year to apply fertilizer, how close to the common areas to apply that fertilizer, how to cut grass clippings, keep it away from the ponds, keep it away from the street drains, etc. So you should be able to contact your common grounds landscaper and ensure that they're BMP qualified. And there are also other education pieces throughout your extension agencies and things like that to help further educate you. I'm going to open it up to Matt here. I've been going on. I tend to throw in, so I don't want to have any just throwing out a jargon alert. I tend to go down little rabbit holes here because I'm pretty passionate about what we do. But I will be quiet now and let Matt take it from here. Matt, I think you're on mute there.
Oh, yeah, sorry. No, that's great information, and I don't have a lot to add on this particular slide. The BMP is a common term. You're right, it's jargon that we hear, but it does stand for best management practices, and I think it's something that all of our landscapers, all of our are generally aware of in our community association industry here. But that's a common term. In fact, in some locations, some parts of the country, a pond is often referred to as a BMP. It's a best management practice to have a pond. And I think one thing to keep in mind, that the reason we have ponds throughout the country is to ensure our runoff, to remove flooding. We design the community to have ponds so that downstream we don't have flooding. When we build a development, we put roads in, we put houses in. The ground does not necessarily absorb the same amount of water that it does in a rainfall. So we have to have a practice, and it's often referred to as a best management practice, just to make sure we're retaining the water, reducing flooding for relatively normal rainfall or a 50-year or 100-year rainfall event. And that's the purpose of the pond, and they are maintenance practices, and they have a lot of other great benefits as well, but they do serve a purpose in our communities. Matt, we can move on to the next slide. So we get this from time to time, and I'll start off here, Josh. You can add in. What's the expected useful life of a pond? A pond, because we do reserve studies, so everything has, in our language, it's always got a useful life and a remaining useful life. Are we ever going to completely replace our ponds? And the answer is no. There really isn't a determinate or expected useful life of a pond as long as it's maintained. Over time, all ponds want to do two things. They want to get more shallow, and they want to get wider. They want to go back to their natural state in most cases. So those items we do have to address, but as long as we do those best practices, and I'll let Josh talk about what those are, but we avoid replacing a pond. We really work on repairing or bringing it back to its more design state over time.
Yeah, great information, Matt. As far as expected useful life of a pond, I think Matt nailed it there. I had mentioned, every pond's different. Could be you could start seeing negative symptoms after 10 years. You could see them after 15. You could see them after 20 or 30. And as far as pond ever being completely replaced, I agree with Matt. I think renewed is a good way to look at it. We like to renew or recycle a pond. And there are ways to do that by, aeration, or plantings, or dredging, or, hydroraking, things like that we'll get into a little bit in the future here, future slides. So again, some best practices. It's just really important to have a qualified pond manager performing routine maintenance. And that may look different in different parts of the country. In Florida, a lot of the routine maintenance are monthly maintenance. You have a qualified pond manager come out on site, technician. He looks at your pond. He will perform a treatment if needed, and he'll observe the surrounding environment. And then there'll be a little report or something like that, or a touch point with that property manager. I think that's really key. You need to have eyes on it. And with someone who's certified, they know what to look for. And in other parts of the country, maybe quarterly, maybe biannually, or something like that. But at least having some sort of eyes, professionally trained eyes on that is a first step. Another way that's monitoring, but there's other ways to monitoring through water quality assessments and so on and so forth. There are many companies out there. Most companies out there do have labs or access to labs and things like that, where they can determine what the health of your pond is. And think of these water quality assessments as, just like you and I were going to if we have a symptom like a cough or a sniffle or, something like that, we don't automatically assume it's COVID, right? We think it's or cancer or whatever. We go to a doctor, a professional, to diagnose what our symptom is, and then come up with a plan to treat that symptom or the causes of that symptom. That's the same exact idea that we're doing here with a water quality assessment. And it's relatively inexpensive, but it'll tell you exactly what's wrong and how to fix your pond. And that rolls right in with this other best practice which is bathymetric mapping. So Matt mentioned a couple of times that, ponds want to get wider and they want to get shallower, right? So sedimentation, siltation, muck accumulation, things like that. Over time, it'll build, reducing the volume of your pond or the overall holding capacity of your pond. And what bathymetric mapping does, it can tell you how much vegetation is at the bottom of the pond and how much muck is at the bottom of your pond, which is super important. It basically creates a contour of the bottom of your pond, identifying, really there's a bunch of different things it'll identify, but most importantly, muck accumulation and vegetation. That'll help with targeting vegetation that you want. If it's nuisance vegetation, you need to remove it. It'll identify how much vegetation is there and how much muck accumulation based off the original, you can compare that to your original plans. So.
Yeah. And I'll just add one of the best practices I've seen a lot of community associations do is to do an initial baseline map. So, maybe as soon as you can, maybe the pond's new, maybe it's 20 years old already, but you do an initial baseline mapping of the pond, and then come back and maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, do another map of the pond and see what's changed. This allows the experts to be able to kind of predict, okay, how much longer do we have on before we really need to come and do something, dredging? Is the silt accumulating in a very fast rate, or is it not problematic? And then usually after those first couple maps are done, then you can kind of determine, okay, how frequently do we want to do this mapping? They've got some new tools out, Josh, right, to do this mapping now. They do it like I think I've seen like drones being used for in some cases.
Yeah, there's drones. There's typical like the tried and true method is there's like a Lowrance system or a sonar based system that pings and bounces off the bottom that's just attached to a boat. Very very similar to what a fish finder almost. But yeah, there are some really cool drone things going on, drone mapping for vegetation and density and things like that. With technology improving every single day, there's bound to be more things. Initially when it comes out, when they first come out, it's pretty expensive, but over time, as they get more efficient, that cost goes down. So. I think, is there anything else on this slide, or we want to go? There we go.
Yeah, we go to the next one.
Yeah. All right. So I'll take this one first, if that's okay, Matt, and then you can hop in. Is dredging a common maintenance practice or a last resort? So in my opinion, this is typically a last resort because it's one of the most expensive line items that you'll come across for your pond. We'll get into ballpark costs at the end of the presentation, but there are a lot of preventative measures to hopefully prevent going into a dredging type situation, and some best practices to maintain a healthy system, promote natural breakdown of muck. This is really important because if you have a healthy environment with oxygenation throughout the entire water column, that promotes aerobic bacteria, which is naturally in your lake, and that will essentially help eat muck or break down muck. So that's kind of number one. I think maintaining that healthy system, there's so many different ways you can do it. By aeration is one, performing those water quality monitoring to ensure the status or the health of your lake is up to par. Watching the nutrient load, best management practices, controlling what goes in, or how much of what goes in and when it goes in. Planting around the perimeter, that's nature's natural filter. So if you plant the right plant in the right place, same thing with landscaping, right plant, right place. You put the right aquatic plant in and around the perimeter littorals, they'll help absorb those nutrients, because if those plants aren't in there, the nutrients have to go somewhere. So you're going to see a symptom like algae or other nuisance vegetation, or it could just promote the decline in the lake health, which promotes anaerobic bacteria, which then can lead to muck accumulation.
Yep, and I think one of the things I've seen is older communities that have always maintained their ponds and kept good water quality, kept the shorelines in good shape. I never recommend reserving for dredging for those communities. I don't think it's needed as long as those other pieces are taken care of. However, in the cases where the shorelines are maybe allowed to erode significantly, or the nutrient loading is such, then we can't avoid it. So, but the cost, when we look at like the cost of ownership of a pond, Josh is right, this is the most expensive and the last resort. If we can do these other things, we'll save a lot of money over the life of our ponds.
Yeah, exactly.
To move right along, thank you. So shoreline stabilization. This is one of the bigger issues that I see with community associations, and a lot of has to do with the particular soils and the design of the pond. But you guys have seen these. If you're golfers, you see that we go to certain golf courses. You see the big drop offs that lead into the pond. You see exposed silt. In Florida here, and in a lot of parts of the country, we have certain parts of the year where it's the rainy season, it's the water levels or the water tables are a little bit higher, so the ponds are a little bit fuller. at some points of the year, and then we have other parts of the year that are much drier, and those then the water quality or the water level is much lower. So what happens is during the wet season, if you just have the grass leading right down to the shoreline, that can, they'll be submerged. And a lot of if it's just regular typical Bermuda grass or turf, it likely is going to die while it's submerged. It's not meant to be submerged. And so then in the dry season, when the water levels recede, then we've got exposed soil, basically sand or silt or whatever soils you might have, clay soils, and those then can erode much quicker because they don't have any roots, any vegetation to hold them in place. And so what happens then, that soil that was the shoreline then moves to the middle of the pond and can cause additional issues. So in order to combat this, I think the best, my recommendation is always first and foremost aquatic plantings. Unfortunately, there's some that don't like the look of aquatic plantings, but I personally think they're beautiful. I think that the right plant, like Josh said, there's a lot of different options that you can have. Josh will probably give you some ideas of the specific plants, for the different parts of the country that would work best. But like it acts as a filter and it stabilizes the shoreline. So it filters all the runoff that's going into the pond, keeps your water quality in good shape, and then also stabilizes those shorelines to keep them from eroding. So it's one of the least expensive that we'll talk about, BMPs, best management practices. But there are other options when plantings may not be desired or may not be feasible in some cases. We see in a lot of parts of the country riprap still used a lot. It's typically larger stone aggregate that is placed in a band around the pond, maybe 6, 8, 10 feet wide. It does usually need to go down into the submerged part of the pond, or you will have that erosion still even in the dry season. So it kind of has to cover that whole span of where the water level would be at low season and dry season. And then is something that also requires some maintenance over time as well to kind of refresh and place it again. The and geotextiles is one that we're seeing more of. There's some great materials out there, and Josh knows a lot more about these. His company does a lot of these restorations using geotextiles that hold the shore in place, and then you can put the turf back down on top of it, and you still have the look of grass running right down to the edge of the pond. But as you can see in the slides here, it's much more stabilized because there is a fabric below holding that soil in place, so it's not going to erode back into the pond. And then seawalls, some places called bulkheads, some called seawalls. Really in isolated locations, they're very expensive to maintain. And usually not needed in many locations. They do make a great setting for an island green, of course, in certain golf courses. But the seawalls are usually not as common with community associations. Again, it's really on the higher end of the cost spectrum. So I would say these four, the way they're listed here, are probably going from least expensive to most expensive to stabilize your shorelines. Anything you want to add there, Josh?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things, Matt. I think, again, I agree, from least expensive to most expensive. The plantings, I'm always going to promote plantings, just like Matt. I do want to note that plantings will not correct erosion that's already happened. It's a great preventative measure moving into the future. So if you're a new community and you don't have erosion, or you're an existing community that's been around for years, you just don't have a lot of erosion. If you don't have plants, I would strongly suggest, getting with your pond maintenance professional and having a survey done. Again, right plant, right place. There's a lot of native aquatic plants out there that are depth dependent, so they won't take over the pond. That's one of the common concerns. So they can only grow into like 2 feet of water, give or take, and they can really create a nice backdrop. There's a lot of pretty flowering plants like pickleweed and duck potato. I'll just give you the common names. I won't get into the scientific stuff. And then there's Gulf spike rush and things like that. But yeah, plantings definitely beneficial, least expensive. Agreed with riprap is generally more expensive. Typically with riprap, you will have to at some point redo that because it will settle. And that just depends on what type of substrate you're working with. Geotextiles is really speaking from my experience, we work with the most. And in the left corner here with the before and afters, that's actually a SOx erosion solution, which that particular textile is a dual layer polyethylene mesh that's like a ripstop type material that you can actually plant into, and as the root structure takes hold, it meshes, it joins with the mesh and actually makes it stronger over time. So it creates what's essentially a living shoreline, and you can cut into that and plant native plants. You can plant trees into it, all this such. And there's applications in place that are 21 years old up in Minnesota that haven't, they're still going really strong. So good great application, kind of in the middle of strength between seawall and like a geotube or something like that. So, but still considered a soft-sided armor. And seawalls, yeah, probably the more expensive or most expensive. I mean, it is permanent, pretty much, but you're going to pay for it. And I do agree. I'm a golfer. It does look good on golf courses. However, I do on my approach tend to hit them. But yeah, so I agreed with all points there, Matt, and yeah, looking forward. We'll talk about prices as we get into the future slides here.
Yep. Yeah, and this slide, I think we kind of covered this. We're kind of running short on time. We wanted to keep it to 30 minutes, so I want to just the Shoreline Restoration. Again, we just kind of talked about this. It is one of the biggest capital expenses we see communities having to undertake. But the best practices is like we talked about, planning the littoral zone. That littoral zone, we didn't really talk about that, Josh. The littoral zone is typically the shallow, more biologically productive spot of area of the pond. It usually covers between 10 and 25% of the ponds. Would you say that's kind of the
Yep.
design that I remember we would shoot for? Is those shallow areas really again acts as the filter for the pond, and the nutrients and things accumulate there and don't reduce the water quality overall.
Yeah.
And then so that's really it. We can go to the last slide. I think we're going to talk about some prices and then move right along here. I know some people have other agendas for today. So what can we expect to pay for these activities? Hydro raking, we didn't get into hydro raking too much. So basically, that's removing the. Josh, maybe you can explain what that is, and I'll talk about how much it costs. Generally.
Sure, I'll try. I'll give you 20 second or less here. So hydro raking is essentially a form of dredging where you can remove silt and muck, but it's a much maybe a max of 2 feet. Where dredging would be a more heavy duty application. But hydro raking can also remove root mass and things like that. That's a lot of the applications that are used.
Yep, and it's kind of a floating barge that goes kind of drives around.
The floating excavator, essentially.
Yep. And so what we've seen communities pay for this, just to give you kind of a scale of what you're looking at, is probably $20,000 to $30,000 per acre. Now, these costs they're going to vary based on the location within the country. They're also going to vary a lot on access. Can you pull this piece of equipment right up to the pond and put it in there? Is it or is it something behind houses that's going to require some other access to the pond or other preparation or mobilization costs? And then, of course, how much material you take out, how heavily vegetated the pond is with hydro raking and dredging too. The cost could definitely vary, but that's kind of a ballpark, $20,000 to $30,000 an acre. Dredging generally is probably 2 to 3 times that amount when you have to actually do the clamshells and dig that out. So when you think about it, maybe an average pond, I don't know, hard to say what an average pond is, but an acre would be a reasonable sized pond. A good sized pond, you might be looking at, again, $100,000 to dredge an acre sized pond. and it all depends on the depth that you need to dredge it, where you can, again, put the material, the dewatering of that material, all goes into those factors. So it's hard to put one number on in a presentation like this when we're talking about the whole country, but just I want to give you guys some frame of mind so that you're prepared for these things when they come up. The aquatic plantings, we already talked about, one of the least expensive ways to maintain the property. I've seen communities put in plants, along their shoreline for about $1 a square foot. Generally, it might be 10 to 20 feet wide that they're putting them in, because you want to have, again, that buffer zone around the entire perimeter. So you might be looking at $10 or $20 per linear foot of pond shoreline. That acre pond might have a 500 linear foot shoreline, so you might be looking at something like five to 10,000 for aquatic plantings versus 100,000 for dredging. Just to give you a bit of the scale again that we're talking about. Riprap is not on this slide, but that's generally about about $60 a linear foot, so probably 3 times the cost of plantings. And then the geotextile, the tubes, the socks that are put in can vary again, but generally probably double the cost of riprap, maybe a little bit less than that. You could go maybe anywhere from like $85 to $150 a linear foot for the geofabric installation. Josh, those costs sound in the ballpark of what you guys see too?
Yeah, reading my mind there. So
great.
I think that's
great.
Very accurate.
Great. Now I know we had some questions, so we want to try to get to those, and that's kind of the end of the prepared material. So I'll just thank you. Some people may want to drop off. We'll like Matt said, we have a recording going here that we can put on. But Matt, do you want to go through some of the questions?
Absolutely. Thank you. First question here. How important is the fish population to the health of the body of water? And are grass carp helpful to the water quality?
Sure. You want me to? I can start there, Matt. So the fish population it's a part of the ecosystem. So, a lot of these, especially in man-made, stormwater retention ponds, you want to have as balanced of an ecosystem as possible, because that contributes to the overall health of the pond, or the food chain, so on and so forth. Again, you want native. You want to make sure you're doing your best to have native fish populations in there. And there are ways to monitor that as well with electrofishing and so on and so forth. As far as grass carp, so grass carp that they're permitted, typically, or they are permitted, and they're actually sterilized so they don't reproduce. And there's a process to go through it. They are a very effective biological control as part of an integrated management program. Integrated meaning biological control, mechanical control, and herbicide control. There are, I think, concerns about sometimes grass carp, what goes in comes out. So there's going to be some nutrient load, but there are ways to monitor that as well. Overall, the pros far outweigh the cons.
Good. Thank you, Josh. Next question here. My pond has a fountain and a spillway. So when chemicals are applied, they leave the pond shortly after they're administered. What could you suggest that chemicals are used for algae management?
So typically with algae management or algicides, most of the there's a couple of different active ingredients with algicides. Typically, it goes to work right away. The main thing is volume when you're applying algicides. So you want to get the algicide on the target, being the algae. So the first thing that the algicides do is breaks down the cell wall of the algae to penetrate the nucleus of the cell, and that kills the cell. So I'm not sure. I mean, sit time is important, but unless there's constant flow, visible flow of your pond, it really shouldn't be an issue. I mean, in a river or something like that, then that I can understand, a river or stream or something like that, then I can understand a concern with, sitting time or holding time with the algicide on the target or on the algae.
Good. Thank you. Moving right along here, next question. Can you suggest any deer-resistant water plants? This specific user is located in Pennsylvania.
I don't know that answer, but I can, I have colleagues all throughout the nation here that I'll reach out. And if you want to share my email address, or I can type it in here.
I do have it up on the slide as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, my email. Oh, there. Yeah, I'm looking right at it. Yeah, if you want to email me, I can reach out to my colleagues in Pennsylvania and see if there's an answer to that. So,
very good. Thank you, Josh. Next question. We already touched on this briefly about the grass carp. Are there any other types of fish that you would recommend in ponds?
I mean, typically you wanna go with what's natural or native to your area. I do know outside of Florida, it is offered in Florida, but outside of Florida as well, there is tilapia stocking for algae control because they tend to feed on algae. I would kind of advise against it in Florida because they tend to overpopulate, and that can reduce the health in the pond and create a fish kill. Because with our extreme hot weather down here, the water temperatures get upwards of 90 degrees in the summer, and the tilapia tend to be the first fish, since they're exotic, to be stressed and cause a fish kill. So I would advise against it in Florida, but outside of Florida, where it's a little bit cooler, that could be an option.
Good, thank you.
Than that native fish, bass, bluegill, red ear, forage fish, things like that. What were the other, catfish, things like that.
Okay, very good, thank you. This next question's multi-part. What's a good plant versus a bad plant to put next to a pond? Also, when you mention aquatic plants are preferred, how might this be different in Arizona compared to Florida?
Well, depends. So good plant versus bad plant. So there's native plants to each region of the world, of the U.S. So typically you can go to your local extension agent. It's usually through university. And you can there's a list of native aquatic plants and native terrestrial plants. Now, the reason it's important to have a native aquatic or terrestrial plant is because they have natural predators to keep them in check, whether it's different soil types or insects or things like that, where an exotic or invasive weed, weed is an unwanted plant, but it doesn't have those natural predators, and it'll outcompete native plants for space. And it can outcompete to the point where it becomes a monoculture, which is basically one species. And we don't want that. Healthy ecosystems have species diversity, which would be multiple species of those native plants. Did I get everything on there?
Yeah, they had another part to this question as well. As far as in Florida, the assumption is that aquatic plants will likely survive much nicer than in Arizona. I'm assuming that's more, temperature, weather related. Is there a such thing as in Arizona as an aquatic plant?
Yeah, there should be. So if there's aquatic plants in Arizona, or there's the drier parts of the country that are specific to that area, and they can withstand drought period. And they don't need as much water, or don't need to have their roots as wet year round. Florida has a drought time of year as well, which we're in right now. And, native aquatic plants are, over time have evolved to withstand that drought time. And it would be the same thing in Arizona.
Yeah, and I think that's good advice to reach out to the local extension, because they will be able to tell you exactly what's best for your specific environment. And it's usually a free service. So,
yeah, or reach out to SOLitude or your local lake management company. There, a majority of us are biologists, and we'll be able to point you in the right direction.
Let's go through about 2 or 3 more questions here. I know we're a bit over on time. If there's any questions that are unanswered, we can certainly reach out to individuals, to address their questions as well. How do these maintenance practices, best practices, relate to tidal creeks and streams? And do they?
That's a good question, Matt. Do you wanna take that one first, or?
Right, sure, yeah. So I think that the shoreline things that we talked about with erosion, we see those with the tidal creeks and streams too. A lot of times those are very heavily vegetated. We see a lot of good, in tidal areas, seeing a lot of mangroves and other natural, again, plants that hold shoreline, hold nutrients as well. So typically we're not seeing, we see a lot of times what we see there is we don't dredge there unless we need to dredge a channel for boating purposes in those areas. Yeah, tidal creeks, you're not going to worry so much. They're usually going to be brackish or salt water, so the water treatment probably doesn't apply either. But dredging certainly can, and then monitoring that vegetation to make sure you've got adequate vegetation, because you will see erosion in some of those areas too that can be detrimental. And again, fill in your channel or fill in your boating areas to the point where you can't get the vessels in and out.
All right. A question on ownership of maintenance. How often do you see where the association does the maintenance versus a city or other government agency or watershed maybe doing the dredging maintenance, for example?
I generally see this as always an association responsibility. I know there's other entities in Florida. We have something called community development districts where they are responsible for the ponds, but generally that's what the HOA is there for. Every new HOA in most parts of the country has to have, or every new development in most parts of the country has to have an HOA or an association associated with it for the sole purpose of controlling that runoff. And so generally they are always the association's responsibility. Of course, city, if it's within an association development, of course, cities or municipalities have their own ponds to maintain and worry about. The water management districts, at least here in Florida, they're going to certainly, they will give you the permitting, they will monitor the ponds, but the cost of that maintenance is generally the owners, the owners association's responsibility. I have seen cases where the owners, I think there was another question about that. Can we shift that responsibility or liability to the individual homeowners that own own their lots around the ponds? And generally that would be a legal question, and generally not, again, because the association was established with the purpose of maintaining that entity, and it is generally their obligation. Is that all that do you think that addressed that question, Matt?
I believe so. Thank you.
Thank you.
One last question here, and then we can wrap it up. Generally speaking, at what depth should our ponds be maintained, and then should we include dredging in our reserves?
Well, I think, and I know, Matt, this is more of an engineering question, but just in my experience in Florida now, this may not pertain to the rest of the nation. Typically, some of the older, you're looking at, right around 10 feet. But there's also a lot of new construction that are 20 and 30 feet plus. So, Matt, I'm going to turn that over to you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's right, and it's all based on the design of that pond. I have in my experience, in some parts of the country, the ponds are often too deep, that they need extra fill to build the houses on. So they dig the ponds extra deep, which can be a fine thing. But what you're going to look at is you're going to need that bathymetric survey to say, okay, what is the rate of accumulation? Is the depth of the pond affecting the water quality? Are we getting too much plantings in the deeper parts of the pond where there shouldn't be plantings? And in that case, then dredging would be needed. Should dredging be included in the reserves? I think in certain parts of the country, in the more areas of the country where we have more seasonal leaves falling in, a lot of trees around the ponds, I think that it is unavoidable in some of those cases. But again, in many cases, if we can maintain the shorelines, maintain the water quality, and take care of the muck and do these other items, maybe hydro rake, if that vegetation grows up, we hopefully can avoid putting dredging in the reserves. But it really depends on the location of the pond, its particular design, right? So it's what it's supposed to be doing is going to determine whether or not it needs to be dredged. And there are areas that just are going to have to dredge in coastal areas. Again, going back to the question about the tidal areas and things like that. That's those channels, again, they fill in with silt eventually, and they do need to be dredged. And so we can't avoid it in some cases, but it's unfortunately a case-by-case basis with your individual ponds, and that's where experts like SOLitude and reserve advisors can try to help you guys determine what's right for your particular community.
Very good. Well, thank you both, Josh and Matt, for your time today. This does conclude today's presentation. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar was recorded. We'll be sending that to all registrants and all attendees. I'll also make sure that all of your questions are answered. So any of those where they were not answered, we'll make sure that Matt or Josh or somebody from their respective teams will be reaching out to you shortly. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for
Thanks,
having me.
everyone.